Hi, I'm Sarah. Welcome to session 1 of our series on sexuality, God and teenagers. In this first video, we want to challenge you to think biblically about sexual orientation and consider how you can share God's awesome design for sex in a way that's relatable and attractive to teenagers. And in a world where sexual orientation has become a modern day idol, we probably all need to take a step back and ask God to remind us of his plans for sex. After all, he designed it. Let's think about the term sexual orientation. What does that mean? Put simply, it's a label we adopt which explains who we relate to in a romantic or sexual way. The most common labels relate to 3 scenarios. Liking the opposite sex, which normally we'd say you're straight or you're heterosexual. Liking the same sex, which would usually be referred to as being a lesbian or being gay. And liking both sexes, which is bisexual. But in our Western culture, there are multiple orientations, and you're going to meet people who relate as something other than these 3. There's so many examples, but there's asexual, demisexual, pansexual, queer, or questioning. It's worth checking out some websites yourself to understand all these different orientations, especially those that focus on conditional thinking, such as demisexual. Demisexual means someone who experiences sexual attraction only under specific circumstances, such as after building a romantic or an emotional relationship with someone. Well, that's been a thing for hundreds of years, but it's never been labelled before. If I don't happen to feel sexual attraction to anyone at this moment in time, do I need to label or define myself? Or should I simply get on with life, trusting that if God has a partner planned out for me, those feelings will come? As you have conversations with teenagers, try and understand the language they use and also assess their experiences. What they know depends upon different factors. Their age, the school they go to and the curriculum that school is teaching. Family dynamics, are there people within their family who are gay? Exposure to social media, TV and film, and then the friends they have and the circles they move in. They may have friends with parents of the same sex, teachers who are openly gay or lesbian, or friends who are already labelling themselves. Encourage them to talk to you about this, show interest in their opinions and their experience, and help them to feel listened to. Now is not a time to enter into a heated debate or show disapproval. And we've got to get better at asking them about what they've been taught at school, what they're chatting about with their friends, and to explore the attitudes they have to sex and sexuality. As you have these conversations, remember that sexual feelings are not a choice. The conversations we are having are not about choosing who we are attracted to, but about our choice as Christians as to what we do with our feelings and attractions. Sadly, teenagers are growing up with this huge spectrum of orientations as their normality. Just think how hard it must be for them to navigate this topic without our support and understanding. So we're going to look at some stats. The stats we're using are the latest at the time of filming and they're pertinent to the UK. But you can always check the Office of National Statistics in the UK or your own country's equivalent for up-to-date figures. In 2020, 3.1% of the UK population identified as lesbian, gay or bisexual. Younger people, aged between 16 to 24, were most likely to identify as LGB, and that was split to 2.7% as gay or lesbian and 5.3% as bisexual, which accounts for 8% of all 16 to 24-year-olds. The overall figure is lower than I thought it would be, but I guess it's hard to tell because we are very reliant on what the media tells us. It's interesting, though, that the trend for bisexuality has increased among younger people. It makes sense when we remember how our teenage years were a period of experimentation, and as we are encouraged nowadays more and more to label ourselves, many who are experimenting may well label themselves as bi. When discussing the stats, perhaps ask what they think the percentages are. Are they surprised at the numbers? Did they expect them to be higher or lower? And what made them think that? We need to understand where their source of truth is coming from. Recently, a YouGov survey showed that Brits think that there are over 8 times more lesbian, gay and bisexual people than there actually are. And that suggests that overrepresentation in the media and public life may be skewing our perception of the population. Having these conversations are important, but a lot of Christians are nervous about talking about sexuality, perhaps because of fear of being condemned for having an opinion that differs from the narrative of the day. But it is so important to chat about this, because most teenagers have already absorbed the worldview, and if we never give them an alternative, they are not well placed to make decisions that reflect God's design for sex. We need to talk about the 2 different viewpoints we can choose to adopt, the world's view or God's view, and why it's important to be aware of both. If we are to make informed decisions about our lives, it's not always that easy to know how to do this. A good place to start might be to explain how sexual identity or orientation is not something that God gave to us, but something that's been created and accepted by people in society. This can be explained simply by going back to Genesis. After Adam and Eve first sinned, the whole of the human race changed and started seeing things differently from how God had planned them to be. And this resulted in us viewing sexuality in a very different way from God's original plan. In fact, our human view continues to evolve and be shaped even today, and that can be seen by the growing number of labels which are being used to define us as sexual beings. The great news is that God doesn't label us in that way. He doesn't look at us and define us by who we are attracted to. That's not important to him. God sees sex as something we do, not someone we are. Are we hampered by a lack of understanding of God's original design for us? Well, that certainly was the case for me. But when we recognise that it was God who created us and we can trust his original design, things get easier. Just because the world's view has changed doesn't mean that God has. The Bible is as relevant today as it always has been. We just need to invest time in reading it. Here's an analogy you might find useful. You purchase a new app, you download it to your phone and you start trying to use it, but it keeps crashing and you don't know what's going on. And eventually you think, well, I'll go on Google and I'll find out what's happening, and you find some help and you start to realise that there were help screens on the app, but you never went to them. God invented us and he knows the best way for us to relate to others. He gave us the equivalent of help screens, the Bible. And we can trust that that's enough to show us the way he intended for us to experience relationships. God made Eve to be Adam's wife, and that was his perfect design for all mankind. But sin came into the world, and we started to see things outside of God's best for us. We threw out the help screens and started to do it our own way. We took on a new and evolving view of sexuality, which differs quite significantly from God's view. Part of the challenge is that teenagers are often only hearing the world's view. We need to be talking to them about what they are learning and then discussing God's alternative ways. It saddens me that Christian teenagers are hearing numerous messages from the world that are counter to Christian teaching, but not always receiving good teaching from within their own church. Some of the predominant messages of the day are things like, if we don't harm anyone else, what harm are we doing? Or, we can only have intimacy, attention and closeness by having a sexual partner. Or, we weren't created to be alone, we should cohabit or marry. Those who are single are missing out. And then, of course, the predominant message that we're hearing, love is love. The Christian message is often ignored because it is countercultural, but it's far more valuable. Our number one priority is to have a relationship with God and receive all the benefits of closeness to him. Use your own personal experience of relationship with God to express how valuable a gift this is. Explaining that as part of your relationship with God, you've given God lordship or total control over your life and have chosen to try and live it in the way that he says is best is a powerful message for any teenager to hear and witness. Within the Christian faith, we believe that God asks us all to look after our sexuality, And God teaches that sex is not something to be taken lightly. It's a gift from Him for those who marry, and for all of us, holiness requires sexual purity. And let's be clear, this message is for those who love God and want to follow Jesus. We are not saying everyone has to follow God's design, but the Bible does tell those who are exploring the Christian faith that Jesus says, "If you love me, you will keep my commands." Do we love Him enough to do that? We also need to recognise that sex is not a right or something we can't live without. God gives us intimacy and closeness, and God puts us in families where we can be supported and loved. Sadly, singleness sometimes carries a stigma within Christian communities, but we can acknowledge that singleness is spoken highly of in the Bible and offers rewards of its own. None of us should focus solely on marriage or relationship, but follow God's plans for our lives as He reveals them to us, focusing our energy on developing a relationship with God before everything else. The best thing we can do is to let teenagers know that as a Christian, you want them to be taught God's worldview, so that they are aware of what God desires for each of us and how God asks us to behave sexually. That way they can consider the views they are being taught at school or via their peers and develop their own balanced view. If you give them all the tools, then they are in a position to make informed choices and decisions for themselves. Understanding what God says and then choosing their response is important. In summary, you can highlight, it's not important to label yourself. God sees the person, not the sexual orientation. We don't have to wear labels because we are all made equal in God's eyes. Who we are attracted to should not be our priority, but forming a relationship with God is our main priority as a Christian. And we must acknowledge that we are not all the same and that some Christians do experience same-sex attraction. It's important that they feel comfortable to talk about this with you. If they feel these attractions, they can be open about how this makes them feel, and you can walk with them. You can encourage them, you can give them resources where they can read about or even get to meet other Christians who experience same-sex attraction to find out how they have reconciled their feelings with their faith. We do live in a society that places pressure on us to be coupled up in order to be happy or fulfilled. Remind them that singleness is spoken highly of in the Bible and offers rewards of its own. So why this constant fixating on marriage or relationship? Let's encourage them to follow God's plans, focusing their energy on developing a relationship with God before everything else. And as you think about that conversation, it might challenge you to think about your own attitude towards singles. Are you the person who's constantly trying to fix up your single friends? Is your church a place where single people thrive? Experiencing same-sex attraction as a teenager is confusing and can be scary. And we don't want anyone to have to navigate this alone, fearful of what you think or how you may react. It's better that they explore their sexuality with you at a young age than navigate it alone and glean their understanding solely from their peers, secular teaching, or the internet. The goal of all these conversations is to open up the way for teenagers to be open about their feelings or how they feel about others who may be experiencing same-sex attraction. They need to know that they will not be judged or condemned, that they will be supported in their journey of discovery, and that being same-sex attracted does not exclude them from church or Christian life. And when they realise this, it means that the communication channels are open for more conversations about how we steward our sexuality in a godly way. Thanks for joining us today and for investing in young people. I hope that I've given you some food for thought and tools to speak to the teenagers in your life. Join us for more videos in this series, which can be found on our website, transformedbygodslove.com. And if you have any questions or would like further advice, please contact us via the website and we will be happy to connect.